Hi, and welcome to another episode of Beroe Talks, where we speak to industry leaders and experts about issues in the supply chain. And today we want to speak about the MRO industry, that is the maintenance, repair, and operation industry, and understand how buyers can reduce their costs by addressing the TCO, or the total cost of ownership. Now, the TCO involves the indirect and direct costs of the product, and I'm sure many of you will agree that the TCO is an avenue for savings for any buyer at a company. But how do we look at the TCO? Many of us address the TCO and look at only a particular product, but some of us look at an entire system. So what should be our approach when we try to understand the TCO that we are working with? And what should be the components that come into the TCO? Because this would impact the analysis that we get out of it and the way we try to reduce the TCO when we try to achieve our cost-saving targets. And this is why I've invited Chris Moore, who has worked with buyers to reduce their TCO over many years. Chris Moore is an Executive Vice President of Operations at SDI, and SDI is a leading integrator in North America. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. It is a pleasure to have you with us today, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Anup. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Chris is joining us from the Eastern Standard Time, so we appreciate the time. And also, he's taking time from his routine work. We know you're very busy, Chris, and we really appreciate this time slot that you've given us, Chris.
It's our pleasure. Anytime, Anup.
So I think your opinion on the TCO would be more credible here rather than mine. So can you tell us about the impact that you've created in the MRO space by telling us your contribution to the industry and your role in SDI and how you've helped companies profit and reduce their TCO over the many years?
Sure. So I think a good place to start, Anup, is how people define TCO, the total cost of ownership, or what we call enterprise MRO total cost of ownership. And if you think about that, really from the time a demand is created, so let's say whether it's a paper requisition that somebody walks in and hands to somebody. So in that case, if it was a paper requisition, we would even include the printing of that paper requisition in that total cost of ownership. Or if it's an electronic requisition, we wouldn't even include the IT systems that are used. To the person that sits there and processes that requisition, the sourcing people that put it on a contract, the freight that's included to deliver it. It comes into the storeroom and it's either delivered as a non-stock buy or it's managed ongoing. And by the way, that's another one that people often overlook in the definition of total cost of ownership is not only did you just bring the inventory into the storeroom, but now you have all of those costs to manage it. Because if you're going to do that appropriately, that includes cycle counting it, rotating shafts, monitoring shelf lives, doing all of those other things, and then even ultimately, if those items go obsolete, there's a cost associated with obsolete inventory. So if you've brought in the inventory and you've brought in excess quantities or the wrong inventory, and it sits on the shelf and it goes obsolete, there's obviously a cost associated with that. But further on down the line, so then there's the cost associated with maintaining that inventory, dispersing the inventory, creating a new demand to replenish that inventory, and then you have all of your back office that's also happening at the same time. That's reconciling thousands of MRO transactions, which we all know can be complex, low-dollar transactions with lots of mistakes and errors made by vendors. Cutting the checks to reconcile all of those vendors and make sure that they get paid and they keep delivering product. And then also some of the other total costs that are there is when tradespeople get involved in that MRO process to say, I need this part or I want that part quoted, and can't easily find what they need. So, as soon as a tradesperson comes off the line, or worse yet, maybe an operations person comes off the line and has to work on getting their MRO parts that they need, that obviously impacts the total cost of ownership. And then the last thing that I would say is, people overlook probably what the true cost is to actually not have the right part in the right place at the right time. And what I mean by that is, very simply, I could say it's when you have a machine down, how much does that cost the plant? But that's the easy one. Let's say that you don't have the right earplugs in stock for an employee and they have to walk across the storeroom or across the plant to another location to get the right earplugs or personal protective equipment of any kind or any part that you can think of, whether or not the machine is down. Every minute that those production employees are spending searching for the MRO goods that they need ultimately impact that total cost of ownership. And then finally, I would say the other piece of that is the savings side of the equation. Oftentimes, people will focus on piece price alone for that total cost of ownership and not look at things like productivity improvements, OEM commercialization, and some other things that you can do in order to reduce that total cost of ownership.
So what I understand is, from your experience, you not only look at a piece price, but you go into a really deep analysis, which includes the sourcing, the maintenance, the possible obsolete inventory that can come out of it. So how complex is the TCO? I mean, I'm sure you worked with buyers, and what would be your take on a perfect TCO analysis done by a buyer?
So it is complex. What I would say is it's not. There's a lot of elements. So the number of elements that are involved are what lead to the complexity of it. But really what happens is if you want to get to the true total cost of ownership and work on reducing your true total cost of ownership, you have to ferret out all of those hidden costs. So as I said, for instance, we mentioned some of the things like freight. Somebody will sometimes go out and just focus on piece price alone and say, hey, I got the lowest possible price. But if you're on the East Coast and it has to come from the West Coast, how much freight was involved in that versus buying it from a vendor locally? There's also some other things that are involved in the total cost of ownership that you have to balance that do get more complex, that usually take some IT systems to help you with. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you're going to call and you're going to buy AA batteries. And I'm using simple examples. This obviously the same principles would apply to complex spares as well. But let's say you're going to buy AA batteries and the guy says, well, I'll sell you a pack of 10 for 10 cents a piece. And so they're $1. But he says, I'll sell you a whole case, 100 for $15 or $20. Well, that might be all fine. However, so now you feel like you've got a really good piece price. However, you've just driven up your freight cost because to deliver 100 batteries is going to be far more expensive than 10 batteries. And do you need 100 batteries? What's the shelf life on those batteries? Are they going to be good? Are you going to have to cycle count them? What's the labor involved to cycle count them? So just focusing on one element alone doesn't get you to the TCO. You really have to have processes and systems in place that consider all of those factors for every single buy that you're going to make. And you have to have separate teams that work to address each one of those factors. So for instance, you have to have a dedicated team that works on supplier management and sourcing. You can't leave that to tradespeople because once again, you're pulling tradespeople out of their sweet spot or out of their areas of expertise. Buyers should buy and transact. They shouldn't source. Storeroom personnel should focus on managing the inventory, cycle counting, dress right, keep right, all of the things that go into having a good storeroom, making sure that they're turning shafts and that we're monitoring the shelf lives and that we're keeping inventory from going bad or stale just by simply sitting there. So there is, you understand that it's complex because of all the elements, but no single item is overly complex to where it can't be done by a common person.
So I think the main point here, I think thumb rule should be that the TCO should include the entire system, including the logistics and the shelf life, and not just the piece price, because maybe that's where people go wrong, and maybe you've been there, done it. So is that a common mistake that buyers make, that they just look at the piece price and they think that they're doing a good job?
Well, certainly it is. It is probably the number one mistake that I see is too much of a focus on piece price. And let me explain or elaborate a little bit further. We think that piece price is very, very important, and I believe that piece price is very, very important. It is absolutely a piece of the equation. I'm not advocating that you should ignore piece price. However, if you just focus on piece price and piece price alone, it's like operating with blinders on. There are so many other elements out there. Really, the enterprise, in order to achieve optimal TCO or the lowest TCO possible, the entire MRO enterprise has to be connected. Everybody has to be working towards a common goal, and everybody that's involved in that connected supply chain needs to make sure that they're doing their part and they're doing it optimally.
Okay, so I think we've established the fact that we need to look at it at an entirety and not just the piece price. So from your experience, can you draw a comparison of the benefits that come out of looking at it as a whole, as compared to those who have just looked at the piece price? Can you give us some idea on how your clients have benefited by doing this based on your analysis of the whole system?
Sure. So, we've engaged obviously with a number of different clients over the last 40 years, and several come to mind. But typically, what happens is let me talk to a typical client, and then maybe we'll get into some specific examples. But a lot of times, what happens is when we engage with a specific client, they always have what I'll call a hot button. So there's a specific thing that they want to focus on, and that one thing alone, again, puts blinders on them. And believe it or not, it's not always piece price. That is the most common error that I see, but it's not always piece price. I've had customers, for instance, before that have focused on every single thing that we order. We want to make sure we have a part number for it. Well, when you start digging into that, that might be a $5 or $6 million enterprise, and they have 50,000 SKUs set up. I mean, it becomes overwhelming to manage an IT system with 50,000 SKUs when we're only stocking 6,000 or 7,000 SKUs, and the stock spend is only 3 or 4 million and a couple of $1 million of non-stock spend. So because they don't have a connected view of that entire supply chain, and they're focused on one element only, which they happen to be measured on, they were passing dollars to pick up pennies, is what I like to say. So they would set up a number for every single item. They didn't care what the piece price was. They didn't care what vendor it came from. They didn't care what the lead time was. They didn't care what the freight was. They weren't even focused on how many went onto the shelf, how many were being dispersed, how many were being obsoleted, what the shelf life was, or any of those other true costs. And they really didn't care about any of the labor that went into every single one of those elements to manage it as well. In addition to that, they had tradespeople coming in from the floor, constantly wanting to set up new parts because they might want a blue version instead of a red version. So there was no compliance there either. So we helped them with that. We helped them get a broader focus on the entire supply chain and connect it all together. And what we did is we drove their total cost of ownership down about 15% in the first year. The thing that's more impressive, though, is in subsequent years, we were able to achieve a little bit higher numbers. The first year was admittedly mostly piece price and getting processes set up for the subsequent years. But the subsequent years, when you looked at the total cost of ownership, now not just piece price alone, the total cost of ownership, all of their freight, IT systems, labor to manage all of those elements we're talking about, they were around 20% for years 2, 3, 4, and 5. So if you consider all of the elements combined, total cost of ownership usually starts out really high with piece price in the beginning years, but in the latter years, it gets focused on things like engineering services. What OEM spares can we commercialize? What inventory can we standardize across all 8 plants? You don't need to have blue, yellow, green, and red ones. All you really need is blue ones because they all have the same fit, form, and functionality. However, you have to have experts in place that can say, hey, the blue one is the same fit, form, and functionality as all of the other colored ones. And I'm using some generic examples here, but you can standardize on motors, valves, or any other MRO SKU in the storeroom.
So I think that hits the nail on the head. And one thing that came to my mind now is, can a buyer do this in-house, using their own talent? So if they want to optimize the entire system over the process of 3 years, do you think that a large buyer, I'm not talking about a very small company, can actually do it in-house and actually get the same results that the best-in-class suppliers can get for them? What's your opinion on this, Chris?
So my opinion is, so can they do it in-house? Yes. What I like to often say, Anup, and people hear me say this all the time that know me, is managing MRO isn't rocket science. What managing MRO is about is having dedicated resources and laser focus on what needs to be done. So if somebody in-house wants to put the resources in place and they want to invest in the same type of systems as a third-party integrator has, and they're going to invest in, engineers, buyers, sourcing people, all of the technical expertise it takes, yes, they could achieve the same results. Now, what I would say is, can they achieve the same results in the same amount of time as an integrator could do? That's not likely, and the reason I say that that's not likely is because there is going to be some learning curve. So, for example, if a large company or a large buyer, as you put it, decided today that they wanted to optimize their total cost of ownership, the first thing they're going to have to do is get a plan together. They're going to have to hire somebody that understands MRO and hire lots of people that are in that management of that supply chain to make sure that they manage it optimally. So they're going to have to put a plan together and they're going to have to execute against that plan. Versus when you do bring in a third-party MRO provider, typically we can hit the ground running. We're able to guide customers through what the normal pitfalls are. But the simple answer to your question is yes, if they're dedicated enough and focused enough, they can achieve it on their own. Their timeline is probably just going to be long.
Okay, I think the last question on my mind is, suppose they decide to outsource it, and because they don't want to go ahead and have a learning curve where they learn by mistakes, would you say that there is a minimum spend that they should be having in order to justify? I don't know if this is appropriate, but do you think that buyers who deal with $1 million and above should probably outsource it? Otherwise, they will be spending a lot on the resource front to get the staffing to do it in the best possible manner, and that may not work out. So what's your take on that, Chris?
So it's a little bit of a different answer, and here is why. So
okay.
If it is a single buyer with a single plant with only $1 million of MRO spend, that greatly reduces the complexity. And what I mean by that is it reduces the number of transactions they're managing, the number of vendors they're managing, the physical size of the storeroom, the number of tradespeople, the number of people that get involved in that process. So if it's a spend that's on that low end of the spectrum, they likely would be just as well off to try to manage it on their own and could achieve similar results. However, they're not able to scale that easily. So, let's say that there's just that one buyer, as you call them, at a plant with $1 million, but they're part of a larger network and there's 10 plants that are $1 million. Well, in that case, I think that they should definitely outsource it because there's economy of scale there. Then the outsourcer can provide the services on the $10 million and leverage that spend with their own spend, leverage their best processes. There's enough level of spend there to justify a return on investment to an outsourcer. And that's also one last comment, if I could go back to your question before. Although I agree and admit that someone could do this in-house and achieve results around the TCO, a third-party provider, if you look at it on a return on investment basis and how much a company is going to invest in optimizing their TCO, a third-party provider is always going to come out with a better ROI if you look at it in those terms, because our timeline is going to be greatly reduced. We've already invested in all the resources. We typically already have all the best practices, and we have expertise on staff. So we're able to ramp up faster, and we have experience doing this. For instance, SDI has been doing this for more than 40 years. So there's not a lot of tripping and stumbling when we implement. Versus if a company was going to start doing this new out of the gate, it might take them 2 or 3 years to start learning exactly what they want to do.
Right. So let me sum it up. And what I understand from our conversation, Chris, is that the most important thing is to not look just at the piece price, but to look at the entire system, especially as you go down the years. And doing this can help you achieve 15 to 20% savings, a reduction on the TCO as you go through the years. And this is fundamental because if you look only at the piece price, you're actually limiting your field of view in terms of what you can actually achieve. And especially if you are having multiple sites and you have a possible economies of scale that can be leveraged, it might be a good idea to outsource it to an integrator. Chris, do you agree with this?
I agree. That's exactly right, yes.
So I think that sums it up. So if you have any clarifications or you want to write to us, you can email me at anup.varghese@beroeinc.com, or you can write to Beroe at info@beroeinc.com. Chris can be reached at chris.moore@sdi.com. Links below. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.